Just come a little bit, we could even sit very casually and a bit more comfortably here to keep it more cozy. So we are just going to do it as informally as we can, because I think we've had quite a lot of big sessions today and it's quite late. So this is the session on helping us think through and move forward in developing an independent commission on public services. We want to get your feedback on how we might frame and focus such a commission. And we want to get your feedback on how we might structure such a commission and what might be the key steps to make it happen. And even to get your ideas on who might be really good chairs, high-profile chairs, or people to join the commission. So it's really, as much as possible, a relaxed discussion. It's not going to be very formal because we're quite a small group. This is an idea that has come up over the last few months, I would say, it was inspired in part by the effectiveness of the Independent Commission on the Reform of International Corporate Taxation, which I think has had a very significant impact on framing how corporate taxation and progressive reforms to corporate taxation. And that is a commission that's been chaired by Jose Ocampo from Colombia, who's now the Minister of Finance of Colombia, with very prominent economists, including Jayoti Ghosh, who we saw earlier today, Magdalena, who we also saw, who's the Executive Director of Global Initiative for Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. Also includes Thomas Piketty and other prominent economists, Joseph Stiglitz. And the power of having a group of very high-profile, widely respected individuals who are reviewing and making comments and producing research. This is interesting. The same will never give them nothing. Interesting. Thank you. I don't think it's a comment on this session, but if it is, someone's gone to great lengths to create. It's very, very impressive. So the Independent Commission on Corporate Tax, I think, been a very powerful space. And what we want to do is to think through whether we can do something similar with an explicit agenda on public services and really trying to challenge the sort of myths and lies around private finance being fundamental to the achievement of development goals or human rights. If you look at the Sustainable Development Goals and the way that they were framed, it was very much an invitation to private finance to come in. And actually, of course, what happened is it ended up with private money really profiting from public budgets. There was never really ever any private money which would come in and add to the total sum of finance. It just created space for public-private partnerships because it was never very clear and explicit that if you're going to achieve the sort of sustainable development goals that were laid out, you really need to focus on public services and on public financing. So the idea, the seed of the idea of this commission would be that we would try to push back against the narrative that the private sector has this pivotal role to play in financing and delivery of services, and to make much more explicit in the global agenda going forward that public financing and public delivery should be at the center of whatever development agenda is laid out post-2030. But with a series of important landmarks moving towards that, starting quite possibly with what is the UN General Assembly Summit on the Sustainable Development Goals in 2023 in September, continuing with the summit on our common future, which will be happening in September 2024, continuing on again to the World Social Summit, which is due in September 2025. These are being different potential moments where a high-level panel of people articulating a pro-public and a narrative and challenging private finance and the myths about private finance could help to shift the narrative and the dial internationally. And then beyond that, feeding into whatever processes there are for reviewing the Sustainable Development Goals and then for articulating whatever global framework emerges in the post-2030 agenda. So there is a paper, and I'm hoping that some of you might have actually seen the paper. Has anyone had a chance to actually look at the paper that was circulated? Could you just raise your hands if you've actually seen it at all? It looks like this, and because I really don't want to be speaking at great length, but hopefully we could try to make sure that if those who can put it up on their phones or their devices to actually look at it. It is linked to this session. I think we really want to be clear that one of the foundations for this conference and this gathering is the work that was done on a manifesto on public services, on Our Future is Public, the manifesto. It's lovely to have a manifesto, and that brings us together as movements and gives us a common reference point. But if we really want to advance the narrative, maybe one of the things that could emerge from this conference would be working together towards building such an independent commission. If you look at how this sort of commission has been structured, if you look at the independent, or ICRICT as it's known, the Independent Commission for Reform of Corporate Taxation, they have quite an elaborate structure with a steering committee, which is from a range of different agencies, a bit like the range of agencies that were behind the organising of this conference, and that you would want to have a structure which has some sort of steering committee, somebody. We've actually had quite a lot of discussions with people who have been involved in ICRICT about what worked and what doesn't work and how to set up a structure that does work. You do need a steering committee. You probably need one or two people in the secretariat to support the work of the commission, but the commissioners themselves have to be genuinely and fully independent. So selecting the right commissioners who have got the profile and the credibility on public services is absolutely crucial. And probably most crucial of all is getting a powerful chair who will then also be able to inspire and bring other prominent commissioners together. I don't know where we are with this piece here. I think it helps to have a wider reference group. So in a sense, this whole conference and all of us who are here could be part of helping to shape this and review the progress. So if we do manage to set something up, and if we did have another gathering like this in a couple of years from now, it would be one of the things which we could also collectively review, give a steer to the steering committee about how we might want to frame this going forward. The big issue is finding a tight enough focus for the Commission to be effective so that it does genuinely, because if you're trying to take on the whole of the public service agenda, it's a massive challenge. So how do we create a sufficiently tight focus to make the work of the commissioners targeted and effective in advancing a dialogue on public services? And that's where we felt the Sustainable Development Goal and the processes associated with that at the United Nations are a useful reference point. In the case of ICRICT, they were very closely connected to the OECD BEPS process and then have been very closely associated with the call for a UN tax commission, a UN tax body. Having a reference point with an existing international process helps to give a focus and a framing. So being hooked into an external process helps. Being fully independent of that, having a clear political vantage point or position based on our manifesto and based on a core narrative around challenging the myths and lies around private finance and private delivery would be one of the ways in which we could focus this. There's a two-page version of how we might articulate a focus, and I don't think it's going to be helpful for me to read through all of that at this point. But one of the things we're sort of conscious of is that the work of the Commission could fit within a wider narrative of a decolonizing of development and sort of offering a critical analysis of coloniality and relations that undermine the sovereignty of countries to set their own economic and social policies in regard to public services, exposing how international institutions such as the IMF and the World Bank and the squeezing of public financing have contributed to an opening of the door to private finance and the role of the private sector. I think fundamentally the idea would be that the Commission would produce a series of reports and briefings drawing on research and evidence which would be out there already. They're not going to do necessarily in-depth research themselves, but pulling together the research and the evidence which is out there and which in many cases, if we get the right commissioners, they would have been connected to or part of in other spheres of their lives. And one of the things which we would want to be very clear about is that the way in which they represent and articulate the case for public services and public financing and public delivery should be something which resonates with all of the different public services that are represented here in this conference. So it would be about education and health and water and housing and care and transport and energy. You want to make sure that you're working on a narrative that makes sense across all of those public services, so it's not just one public service and not playing one public service off against others. I'm thinking that that might be enough for me to say in terms of an introduction, and what we thought, if we had a larger group, what we were going to do now is just ask you to chat to the person next to you for a couple of minutes and then share any initial reactions, any initial questions or comments. But just to sort of loosen it up, if you want to have a chat with somebody sitting next to you for 3 minutes or 5 minutes, does this make sense? What more would you need to know about it? But particularly, we're going to try and do this in two separate segments. Firstly, talking about, does it make sense to set up such a commission and the focus? How would we tighten the focus of the commission? And then we'll have a separate moment when we might talk about the structure of the commission, how we support such a commission, and the steps that we would take to make that happen in practice. So the first little just sort of chat would be, does this make sense? Do you think it's a good thing to do? And how would we focus the commission in a sufficiently tight and coherent way for it to be a genuinely valuable thing for all of us working on different public services? So I'm going to shut up now. I suggest you chat for 3 to 5 minutes, just loosen up, have a chat, and then come back and we'll hear some different inputs.
Sorry, everyone speaks English, no? There's no one who needs Spanish or French.
¿Quieres otro micrófono?
Pero solamente estaba preguntando sobre la traducción. Está bien.
Ask questions. Do you think this makes sense? Somebody you haven't met before. So this was just a very quick warm-up, just to make sure that you've had a space to talk to someone. And we would just want to hear from anybody who wants to share. We're not asking for feedback from groups, but anybody who wants to contribute anything about, does this make sense? Is it a good idea? And we'll just start with anybody who wants to.
I'll just break the ice with a question. So the Commission, I mean, I didn't read the paper, so I'm sorry if I'm asking something that is self-evident. By the way, Eduardo Arenas, Open Universiteit, the Netherlands. Is this Commission going to give place to what juridical instrument? And what's the interrelationship that you expect to have between this Commission and states?
I'm not going to pretend that I've got all of the answers. I'd be quite interested in anybody else's answers to that question. I don't think we've gone into great detail, but the idea, so if you look at the ICRICT, it doesn't formally have a relationship with states. It's a sort of independent authoritative body which is respected by many states, but it's not organically connected to that. So the independence is, the intention is to create something genuinely independent. Does that make sense?
It's supposed to be like a group of coordination for special rapporteur. The problem is the status. It's quite difficult that without any strong status, they could have a strong influence, impact. Because we experienced that with the special rapporteur, they very difficult, they can be heard and have the right feedback from the states when they highlight the violation of the human rights. So, not as important, but.
So that is an interesting question. Let's just carry on round and we will come back round, but it's an interesting challenge. Yep.
Yeah, okay, what we were discussing here is like how to avoid that this council kind of is not just a repetition of already existing things. Like, for example, yeah, UN Special Rapporteurs or the WHO did recently this economic council for the economics of health for all, which is also like formed by progressive economists, you know, Mazzucato, Jayati Ghosh, and like, but the feeling is this council, like the audience, what's the audience of this council? Why nobody's listening to it? At least that's my impression. We should learn from.
Yeah, we also
from
need to
this.
learn that sort of experience.
Thank you. Hi. Listen, I think I perfectly understand the meaning, the purpose, and what we are trying to build up. And no doubt there's the need to have an authority, not in terms of in legal terms, but you know, that has a moral authority to address this issue. But I think that the comparison with ICRICT is risk to bring us not in the right direction, because with ICRICT the scope was clear, addressing corporate tax system, and that was one issue, clear, and addressing the corporate taxation at global level. So influencing the financial institution, global financial institution. In fact, the first claim is creating an intergovernmental body under the umbrella of the UN. So that's clearly what we decided to do with ICRICT. Here it's a little bit more complicated because, first of all, we need to identify what we mean by public services, and listening a little bit of the discussion we had in these days, there's different approaches, there's different ideas, and above all, we have different level of interlocutors that we can address on this. So first, we need to decide what is the scope of this commission, which public services we refer to, and how is conceptual, is about the policies, because we have the policies of the financial institution globally. We need to address the issue of the regional development banks that often are more aggressive than the IMF or the World Bank in driving privatization of public services or business. We need to address the issue of bilateral or plurilateral trade agreement that include the privatization of public services. So for me, it's very much complicated. And before talking about the form that we want to give to this commission and who will chair what, I think we need to dig a little bit more in that areas to identify. What made ICRIC successful, in my view, apart of the clear definition of the scope, the identification of commissioners that were really expert in the areas, it's also the fact that we looked to real independent persons that were not members of any of the organization promoting. Close to us, of course, but that's the first thing that we did to identify who could have the authority, the recognition also of being expert and being able to influence. And we have been able to do important steps forward with this decision. So maybe this second moment of discussion, but first I think that we need to dig a little bit more in what we want to achieve with this commission and what we want to tackle also.
Similar points. For me, what is not clear is the audience and who this commission would try to influence. And I'm not sure, I mean, if the aim is to have another body that is talking in the space of global development, I'm not sure we need it. Not because the existing spaces are perfect, but I'm not sure that we need to say more on the importance of public services in the spaces that, again, as economic justice movement, we try to influence with our work normally. It seems to me that what we keep saying to each other is that there is need of more political influencing and changing the narrative. So it would be, I would see something like this to have a strong political voice. And when I was thinking of potential members, a number of politicians came to my mind. Jeremy Corbyn, just to say one, Nicola Sturgeon, people who actually then attract influence and can influence others and anyway have national chapters. But then on the other side, go, take people from the arts. A Ken Loach, that talks about public services, or go with a little bit of the unusual suspects, not because, the person who are in the list now are all wonderful and would all do a great job, but if we want to try to attract a different audience, we may want to have some who, speak a little bit of a different language. And with taxation, and corporate taxation is a bit tricky to do, but with public services, there is so much that we can draw from. That I think it would be an exciting way to develop this.
So, in addition to the question of delimiting the boundaries and who is the audience, there's the question of, is this the right space that we are building it on? are the SDG related structures the right structures? If there's anything that one has learned in the last 8 years, follow-up and review processes of the SDGs are extraordinarily weak. The capacity to dictate policy is minimal, and there is no money on the table. So therefore, should one latch on to a process that one knows is weak from the start and has no teeth, versus, for example, figuring out some mechanisms which are more Geneva-based, for the lack of a better word, with some structure which has some power somewhere, basically. Geneva-based in some form.
Do you mean the international human rights?
Human rights related structures of some kind, which at least have some in human rights, some framework, some recommendatory power, some enforcement power, howsoever weak.
I mean, look, one of the things that I think needs to be addressed at the UN level is this common belief that private money is going to come in, and that somehow, through all this blended and innovative and de-risking, they're going to bring in private capital into public services. And to me, it's amazing, but it's similar to what I saw 20 years ago when everybody was talking about PPPs, public-private partnership. They all believed it. They had no basis for it. There was no empirical evidence that it worked, but they believed it. And so, you know, is it, and I know we've had this discussion, and I will admit that I've you know, worked with Archer and the core group. Do we focus on financing public services? Is that too narrow, too complex? Are there too many actors? But right now, I see this common delusion throughout the UN system that if only they can get BlackRock in, if only they can get Vanguard, and we got to deal with that now. Now, that's my thought.
Hi, James Bartholomew's from the International Transport Workers Federation. I'm going to take a slightly different line to some of the other contributions, and I'm going to say that if we're going to add value with this commission, despite my personal sympathies, precisely the people we don't need are the Jeremy Corbyns and the Ken Loaches. We need the insiders. We need the people who have credibility on the inside of the World Bank, the credible voices for the World Bank, for the IMF, for the regional development banks, and so on. But those who we can rely on, despite their independence, to come up with the sorts of answers and recommendations that we would like them to. And the Venn diagram of those two groups is potentially very small indeed, which might help us narrow down potential commissioners. The thing that springs to mind in this is, and we all know how this ended, but the approach that Yanis Varoufakis took during his brief tenure as Greece's finance minister. Obviously, lots of progressives arrayed in support of the government at that time, but what he did was attempt to mobilize precisely the people who you would expect to disagree with him in trying to pressure the European Commission, the German government, and so on, into a better deal for Greece. So he went to the US, he was talking to the mainstream economists, he was trying to leverage them to see sense. Obviously, it didn't work out in the way that anyone here hoped, but I think a strategy like that to influence the common sense, as David was saying, of the World Bank, of the IMF, is where we're going to add value with this, if at all.
Sorry. I just wanted to ask a quick question, and forgive me if this is mentioned in the paper, but how, just reading kind of the structure, that's going to take funding, and that's going to take financing, and kind of what ideas are there to how we finance this commission if we agree that this is the right way forward, and how we finance it and fund it in a way that the organizations that are funding it don't kind of determine what the outcome or what the scope or what the kind of analysis is of the commission.
I think let's carry on round and then we'll say a few words to try to steer it back. But yeah.
So I agree with most. My name is Rodrigo from the Global Initiative. Agree with most of the things that have been said. I think these questions are on the table, and we have like this intuition that this is something that can be powerful and useful, but it's a little bit our challenge here of refining that and really asking ourselves these difficult questions to see if after this process this really makes sense or not. So I think there's a lot of really important questions on the table, like who, where, how to finance it. I think maybe a good question to start with is what and why. And I think we have this general idea of a commission that can help us defend public services. But I'm not 100% sure of what I'm going to say. But I think we're in a moment where we have to go to the offensive, not the defensive. So if we're going to have a commission that repeats that we cannot privatize public services because they're very important, we're going to be replicating something that we're doing through a new organ or space. And at least what I feel that has been part of the conversation these last few days is, hey, things are happening that we didn't expect to happen. Like Jayati was talking about the UN Tax Convention. The OECD deal last year was maybe impossible if Biden hadn't pushed it. So 3 years ago, that didn't seem possible. And today, well, it's sort of been pushing forward. And in that sense, there is a sense of crisis. And in crisis, things can go either way. Or we can go towards quicker privatization and reduction of public services, or we can propose an alternative. And I think part of that alternative has to be around public services for the 21st century. I don't want to use any wrong language here, but not on just how to defend what we have, but how to promote something stronger, something more powerful. So again, I'm going to step on some eggs, don't want to get in, but Hillary Cottam thinking of how public services can advance towards the 21st century point of view, stuff like this that we can sort of put a voice into the public that is saying not only defend what we have, but move forward. There is something that may allow us to guarantee our human rights better, allow us to have healthier economies and people. So yeah, I just want to put a little bit of those ideas on the table and pass it on.
So look, I want to be very clear, we have not locked down anything, and it genuinely is an open discussion at the moment. I think there's some really interesting thoughts that are coming up here. I think the idea of connecting with the Geneva human rights spaces rather than an SDG process, which is so weak, linking with political. I think political leadership is absolutely fundamental. This is, in one way or another, trying to shift the dial with politicians and with governments. I think that needs to be a central objective. The question is, do you hook yourself to a particular process to get there? We have been talking about, getting someone like Michelle Bachelet to be a chair because she would come with a political weight and a human rights background, and actually that could be quite an interesting, way of whoever is the chair could contribute to helping to frame. But there are imperfections with almost every proposition for who we might approach. And who you approach will help, will influence how you shape it. One of the things which I think has come up more interestingly, and actually in the discussions I've had here, is whether or not this idea of focusing on public services for the 21st century, actually making an explicit link with the climate space, and whether or not what we're really about is a revisioning of public services in the light of the climate crisis, and how you build more resilient states for the 21st century, knowing that we're facing a time of climate crisis, and how you both vision them and finance them in the face of the climate crisis. That gives it another impetus, I think. And it is genuinely the case that there is work to be done, to be creative in thinking about and how to articulate the case for public services in that climate space. Because my impression is that in most of the COP negotiations, you don't have a very explicit narrative around what happens with all this climate finance that is being talked about. In fact, it seems to me that a very large amount of it is going to end up, if you're not careful, in the space of loans, not grants, and in the space of ending up probably in private hands and not public goods. So that might be an interesting space to pioneer. But all of this is open, and I think the more that we can bounce around ideas, the more we might actually get to something where we find some strong common ground. So let's just carry on the discussion at this point, I think.
So I wanted to make a contribution, and I'm sorry if it will be a little bit technical. I am a lawyer. I work on public international law. And one of the things I wanted to say is that for lawyers and in the international legal language, what counts a lot is whether or not something becomes customary international law. And so I spent time looking at, what the status of public services is under customary international law. And you get to find that pretty much on the basis of what international courts say, and also of what states, the state practice is, what states do. And the main instrument at the international level, and we've discussed this at length at the Health Commission, is General Comment 14. And if you look at paragraph 12, letter B, which speaks about the important issue of access to health services, you have there a very clear public-private divide. And this public-private divide normalizes the distinction between public and privately provided services, which have to be made affordable to all. So the first part, which is in my view the most important, somehow becomes less important because of the goal, which is affordability. In a way, what happens is that it doesn't matter so much whether it is public or private. The goal is, if it is affordable, we can even be in agreement with private services. And you can think, and that is actually the most hegemonic position, well, this is actually a good thing, because what we need to have at the international human rights level, it's a type of very comprehensive accountability, so that if states choose to go private, we still are going to have human rights instruments to make them accountable. However, that also contributes to normalize this weird status on private and public services where both of them come into the table of human rights, and both of them become legitimized avenues to the development of things that, at least in my view, and I think on the view of many of you that have been speaking, can only be carried out by means of public services. So it's not just about the goal, it's about who carries out those things. And this forces us, in this critical constellation, in the human rights movement and human rights activists, and many more, on take a determination on whether or not human rights can be satisfied when it comes to issues of accessibility through the private sector. And I think that there we need to really take sides pretty much on the basis that they shouldn't. I mean, if not, then what is it that we are discussing? So this is a very technical goal, to take public services into a more robust status within customary international law, but it's a goal that I could think we could try to put our minds and see on the basis of that goal how we could reform instruments like general comments that exist at the UN, and see whether or not we can bring this later further into the practice of states and also at the level of the practice of courts.
So I would admit some guilt to have perhaps a year ago have suggested in a call the idea to have a public services commission. So I want to share the burden with David, and I think others have come on board since in having started the thinking. But I agree, I think we go very carefully, because maybe it's a bad idea, or maybe it needs time to think the right angle. So I think these are all very good comments, and let's try to make progress, and we don't have to conclude anything right now. I think I will start one very good question that Chiara asked, and I think that's what we should start from, is what's the objective? So what's our theory of change? What's the problem? And how do you think this can help with our problem? And I think the way you articulate, Cara, I really agree. What we feel is that we want more political power for public services. So there's no strong, visible political body that does marketing for public services. But the private sector, they buy advertisement, they do all sort of push everywhere in visible ways. I mean, in the US, you see advertisement for private healthcare anywhere, but there's no advertisement for public healthcare if you want. So I think we feel the need to have a body that would push, advertise, normalize the idea that public services are good. And I think this is where the parallel with ICRIT is. More like, I think in tax has been quite successful in normalizing the idea that more tax could be good. Not everyone agrees, but it's a normal conversation now. Public services, we try, all of us tried, some on a large scale, like PSI, some on a much smaller scale, but it's difficult. So maybe do we agree on that? Do we agree on the problem that it'd be useful to have a body that is more visible than any of us alone and together to make more visible our demand for public services? And if we ought, I might have impacts on the other questions. No, the bigger question everyone is raising at the end of the day, there's two questions I think everyone is raising. One is what's the composition, and I think that I like some of the ideas that emerge with having more people like Bachelet who will help bring on board the kind of people we have a harder time talking to, or other people who sort of will try to keep with us, so we need to make sure we are progressive enough people, but we'll manage to speak and influence and normalize the discussion in places where it's hard for us. And then there's a question of focus. I guess it's what you were alluding to. What can we focus on that would be meaningful? I agree with your comment. I personally don't think SDGs is an amazing way. I think SDGs have barely any impact. We're going to spend a huge amount of resources, and we don't know whether we have any impact. I mean, in the previous SDGs, everyone fought, and at the end, we got PPPs in there. I'm like, what are we going to get in the next one? Is it worth fighting anywhere? The whole thing is closed down and controlled by people we don't have out there. It might be useful, though, to use PPP's process, more of the process, not so much for the SDG itself, but to give us like political momentum. Another suggestion I've been trying to push could be to create our own process. I mean, increasingly, international institutions are becoming weaker, more questioned. We keep on saying institutions are politically captured, and yet we keep on going there. I'm thinking we should still keep on going there to try to avoid a capture, maybe revert it one day. But I'm thinking, why don't we create our own structure, our own space, that we make it becoming big enough that it becomes unavoidable, almost like an alternative UN, if you want. So my thinking is, why don't we could imagine, for instance, the Commission very concretely to come up with, let's say, a pledge. We wanted to have a pledge at the end of this conference. We realized it was way too complicated. But we could imagine having a commission that says, okay, we're going to come up with like 10 requirements, and we're going to go around and ask governments and local authorities and ministers and mayors to commit to that, or something like this. I mean, maybe we need to focus it a lot more. But something we do our own process. We don't necessarily have to tag along the UN stuff that we don't control. It's going to end up in like something super vague anyway. But we create our own things, and we create our own dynamic. That's just one idea, but my point of being behind is more like we can be creative. Like, let's not get too. If we think we need a political advertisement body, if that's the starting point, maybe we'll discuss it. But if we think we need that, then let's think about creating a body, and let's create, if we need the focus, the institution that we need to have. Indeed, we need focus. We can't go all over the place in the way that we like, or that we find an existing process out there, maybe human rights-based institution in Geneva, but I'm worried this is too narrow and not powerful enough. I think creating our own process, you know, if we get the 400 people here, the 200 organizations that are behind this conference, supporting a commission and moving together and like saying, okay, we're gonna push very hard and be behind a commission that comes up with like something that we all push for, are we really less powerful than spending our time in SDGs? I don't know. So I'm posing more questions.
I just also wanted to put another thought out there that, you know, why are we kind of thinking about this as having one international commission? You know, I think Rosa said earlier that maybe there's stuff going on regionally that might have more impact, and maybe supporting initiatives that are happening regionally, because obviously public services is a great example of huge variations in the regions, and having another international body, is it just an extra layer of bureaucracy that maybe resources might be better spent supporting, organic initiatives that are happening, and maybe creating this commission might just lead to the same people saying the same things. I think we as a movement need to be quite careful that we're not just talking to each other about each other, and kind of, how can we maybe instead think of ways that we can kind of, push the boundaries of who we engage with and how we engage with them.
I mean, just a thought on the purpose or the focus. And I don't have an answer necessarily, but I'm just worried about if we have a financing focus only. There's been a lot of financing commissions. And I just, something that you said, Sylvain, kind of sparked for me this, I think one thing that is missing that I think maybe we're grasping at here, that we're like trying to solve with this commission, and maybe a commission isn't the right answer, but just I think it is that narrative about the public not being viewed as the powerful force that we see that it can be, and that there is maybe this narrative change goal that we might be trying to solve, that we feel like we're not getting the traction that we want to get in communicating this powerful message. It's not just about money, it's about money is essential. We need money is non-negotiable, but we need it for public provision, and I worry. So I don't know if a commission is the right way to solve that problem. And there are many other problems, and financing is a massive one. So I'm not saying it shouldn't be about financing. It's just maybe that it feels like we are just struggling to get our message across. And I don't know if that's maybe the right focus.
I mean, I don't want to take too much time, but I think that we should answer a question before deciding what we want to focus on. And this question for me is, what is favoring the environment for privatization of public services, which we perfectly know, but there's different factors, but there's a factor that is fundamental in my view. And this is the ideology of the public debt. And then everything comes after that, no? The fact that you need to reduce the debt, the fact that you need to balance the public budget, the fact that you need more investment. Focusing on financing of public services, I am afraid that will bring us nowhere, because we will have immediately the opposition of all the people that say, yes, but there's no money, we cannot pay for this, we cannot pay for that, and we're done there. So maybe thinking to the structural reasons that are feeding the privatization ideology is something that we need to think about. And for me, this is one of the main points.
Yeah, maybe just to add to what Rosa just said, the World Bank has a group that works on health financing, and in their recent publications since COVID, what they say is, we acknowledge that public system should be healthcare system should be publicly financed, but they say, oh, well, but there is no money, so these are the scenarios, and then they give recommendation based on these scenarios, of how much the government budget is constrained. So yeah, definitely, I think it's not that what makes them prove their point is more the fact that there is no money than that public financing doesn't work. So maybe we should indeed focus on what doesn't work, because the creative solution they come with, like they come forward, like blended finance, PPPs, all this stuff, we should demonstrate that it doesn't really work. Yeah.
I'm talking like a practitioner and from the Global South. Going back to her issue of looking at the structural problems, I've seen from experience, and many people have also can attest to this, is that where I come from is that to make the private thrive, they have deliberately killed the public. And why have they killed the public is because the policymakers, the politicians, they own the private. Besides owning the private, there is the exit completely. Their exit. So there is exit of voice and everything. When we have a commission in place, there are certain things that are going to be done by the commission. And probably we expect that when this trickles down, we expect the policymakers, the politicians to implement, for instance, the decisions or recommendations that are coming from the commission. But is it possible that they are going to be able to implement against where they are getting money from the private sector? Is that possible? So I've also been thinking that at the end of the day, with all the work that we are doing with the UN bodies and all that, the treaty mechanisms, it all boils down to implementation, that we go to these mechanisms and get very good decisions, very good recommendations and concluding observations. But at the end of the day, when we go back to implement, still we are going back to the policymakers, we are going back to the politicians, and that political will is not there to implement. So the key thing here is that who gets on this commission is also very key. When you talk about former president of Chile, and I'm sitting here and I'm like, in Uganda, is my president, who is very stubborn, going to listen to that person? So I liked the idea of having, like, you know, this regional approach, but still, even with having the regional approaches, I'm thinking that the backlash would be like, why don't you use existing mechanisms and make ways of making the existing mechanisms stronger? Because what I'm seeing also increasingly, for instance, when you look at a body like the African Commission on Human and People's Rights, states have captured it. Egypt has captured the African Commission, and they are bringing a lot of money in funding. And you see that the civil society is losing grip, that they don't even have the space, because Egypt has come with a lot of money. And because civil society was talking about human rights record in Egypt and all that, for them to make good is to bring in money into the commission, because the commission is struggling with funding. So how do we balance all this and make sure, first of all, like legitimacy? Are the political actors going to buy into this? When a recommendation comes from the commission, is it going to be implemented? Who is this? Is it, you know, I'm really struggling as a person with this. It's a big struggle for me.
I must say, one of the things I'm just more and more drawn to is that in the end, this is about sort of trying to mobilize political weight, and a political weight that we don't have as individual organizations or even as a collection of movements. And I think it is politicians, and it is targeting politicians that is where we need to get to. And yes, one president from another continent may not do it, but if you had a handful of ex-presidents from different countries, from different continents, and prominent political leaders who could bring new weight and whose collective word would attract a media attention in the way that ICRIC genuinely does. I mean, to be clear, ICRIC has a massive media presence because of the political weight of the people involved in it. And I think we need something like that. Now, I think on public services, it's not quite so straightforward as sort of the prominent economists that surround ICRIC. But I think, you know, it is still driven by people who actually do have a genuine political sense of the world, either politicians or a very deep political sense. So let's be very clear, this has got to be about building political momentum, shifting political attitudes. I think the target audience is, in fact, heads of state and ministers of finance. And they are hopefully going to be, you know, the aim would be to try to influence them based on incredibly compelling evidence and arguments put together by a compelling group of people. Now, I'm less and less attracted to the idea of tying it to the SDG process. I thought that was quite an interesting idea, and I think it is sort of dead in the water because the SDGs are so weak and unenforceable, so I definitely take that critique. I think doesn't mean that there's not some possibility of using that space and influencing that space as part of the intentionality, but to try to tie it too much to the SDGs would be problematic. And so maybe, you know, I think you could have an independent commission with a political weight that sought to contribute to a range of different processes around the essence of the defense of public services and explicitly public. It's about shifting the narrative to be explicit about the public because, let's face it, the vast majority of the development discourse and most places, people just, they'll talk about health and education, but they won't talk about public health and public education and the absolute necessity of the public. Why we need to talk about the public, I think, is still something which, you know, a powerful group of political leaders. I actually quite like a whole collection of the names that have been suggested, and we need just more and more names with the political weight that if they were working together, potentially quite unlikely people to find together in the same room and in the same initiative, that really could be quite transformative. So I'm veering towards going for much more high-profile political leadership and a group of people who would commit to working together across continents with credibility in each continent and with champion. And the starting point has to be a core alignment with the Public Services Manifesto that we've worked on collectively, which guided and underpins this conference. I think that's your start. You wouldn't want to have anybody involved who didn't have a clear and explicit commitment to that as a sort of founding statement.
If I can add to that, so there's a bit of a discussion. I think the question you raise is, do we need a public services body when it's all about money, and we have ICRIT in a way that is dealing with the money? And I think it's a fair question. There's a good question of articulation there. And you mentioned the example of debt. But one thing that strikes me is, to which extent do you think that the argument they make that there's no money or that there's debt and needs to be paid, to which extent is it genuine? Or to which extent is just an excuse, it's a way to market why it's a much deeper ideology? Because I've seen a lot of countries that are not in debt, that have very good income, even some that have good taxes like Sweden, that are massively privatized. So Sweden in the 1990s privatized the whole education system. There's no debt issue. There's no amount of money left. They have good taxation. The real reason I think most of the people who privatize do is that they believe private is more efficient. They believe too big public is bloated. They have a more fundamental philosophical vision of the world. They believe that individuals competing are more efficient. And I think that bit is not addressed, I think. That's where we have a gap potentially, is addressing this. And remember, this idea that we should compete, that we are individuals in our little corner, that we need to fight with each other, and the more we fight, the more we'll be efficient. I mean, it's not so old. It essentially developed in 60s, 70s with some Chicago schools economists who developed some theories, pushed it into Chile, and then became the thing everyone pushed for. And I'm thinking, maybe we need to do the other thing, articulate why is a vision of public, but why do we want to be together, make it appealing, it becomes, why, it's kind of very interesting, I don't know if you know more, but why did neoliberal idea, this idea of competition and small state become so popular? it's not so much evidence. I mean, we can track a bunch of things, but at some point, for some reason, it became sexy. It became something appealing. It became something every minister, I mean, we've talked a lot together to governments, and we go and then naturally go there because that's kind of the mood, the flow. And what I'm thinking maybe this commission could bring is change that flow, make the mood, the kind of thing that becomes sexy is like, oh, actually, you know what, building a really good community-based healthcare system or energy system is actually super cool. And we have one country over there that tried, and there's this bunch of like leaders that work with this one country. They work together on a pledge, they tried something, and it's actually looking super good. We keep on hearing about it in the news. They keep on coming to speak to us. I'm not so sure why as a leader, but I feel like I need to go there. I feel if I go there, I'm going to get more votes. I'm going to get elected. I feel we need to make the idea of neoliberal competition something of the past, something that is like old and falling apart, and make our new, and that's why I like also the public services of 21st century, linking it to climate, like a group of bodies that really help us marketize, essentially. No, but not only marketize, think about it, but also marketize the idea that it's really good to be together and have strong public services and good, well-paid, workers. Maybe I'm not so sure that it's almost the non-financial part is really dealt with by any international body at the moment. And it's not at all in opposition, it's complementary. Almost I feel like we need to walk on our two legs. We need to walk on the legs of, we need to raise funds and counter austerity, and we need to walk on the legs of, we know why we want to do that. We don't want to raise money just to raise money because we are fun about taxes and we don't care about that. We do care about not living debt forever, but we have something much more important we care about is living together, and we love that. There's a lot of motivation. It's not just us, it's a bunch of people around the world, leaders, former leaders, people responsible. I think that kind of idea, tell me if I'm wrong, maybe that's where there's a gap. Again, I'm not sure, it's a question you raised, is the Commission the right response to that? But if you have a better idea, we can also explore.
Thanks. With all the talk of shifting narratives and shifting public perception, I just want to sound a note of caution about separating the high-level political advocacy from the movement building. These are two very different things, and we are not going to build public momentum. We're not going to build the social movement for this, social movements for this, with a committee of experts. It's a totally wrong solution to that problem. I think there is added value here in the way we've kind of talked about applying some kind of expert influence and pressure to policymakers, both elected and unelected. That is a very different response, and I think a complementary response to what we're all doing in our day-to-day lives, which is when we go back home from here, working with grassroots organizations, working with trade unions and so on, to shift the kind of ingrained social perspectives on precisely these sorts of questions. So I don't think we should fool ourselves that we're going to solve that problem with this solution.
100. I don't think we ever intended to suggest that the building of the movement, that's where we are here. I think this might be something which acts as a useful beacon, but it's not itself going to do anything to strengthen the movement. That's a different set of challenges which we are working on. We all need to collectively work on. But yeah, absolutely. Let's be clear that that's a separate challenge. I do think there can be some quite interesting interaction between having a compelling political sort of leadership out there, which is championing public services in a way that I don't think has been happening. I can't think of such a body being out there. There's nothing which I can think of that sort of seeks to do this at the moment, and I think it could be very exciting. I think quite a lot of former political leaders, former presidents and heads of state and ministers of finance might find this a really compelling idea to get behind. And if you get the right people, I do think it's about getting the right people, that will help. But I want to come back to where we started with ICRIC having a very, very clear, tight focus. And I still think we need to be clear and sharper about the focus. I don't think we have to resolve everything. I think it's a good idea to then engage some of the political leaders who we think might be effective champions and have that more detailed dialogue with that group of people and see if between them and in a dialogue with a steering committee we can come up with something which is sufficiently compelling and focused. But I still think that there's work to be done to get the tide to focus. And I do think there's a bit of a divergent thinking here about where that focus might be. Challenging private financing and the myths and lies around private financing, I think, is really compelling. What we perhaps don't want to get too much over, if you get too much into, well, the solution is this, then ICRICT is doing a lot of work on corporate tax, which is obviously such an important ingredient. So we don't want to duplicate, we don't want to sort of repeat what some people are already doing on that agenda. Any final reflections? Because I don't think we need to. I mean, we're not going to resolve everything today. I think it seems to me that there's a lot of interest and excitement about the idea. We've still got to elaborate it further. I think we need to have a sort of concept notes that and sort of lay out perhaps a series of options about what we might do next. But I do think there are questions about, if you were to do this, what might be useful next steps from where we are today. What might be the next thing for us to do in order to make this happen? And anybody who's got some thoughts on that, I think would be welcome.
So that question is also Sylvain's question about how to make public services sexy, right? And it's a very important question because it is about an image, a mental image that common ordinary people need to have about our ideas, why we are trying to convince them of eliminating this very extremely powerful cultural image of a private service that will actually give them what they want when they want it. And what we are actually trying to say is that those gray places filled with holes in the walls are actually the thing that we want for them. So it's quite a challenge that we have. And to change that narrative is a very difficult thing. But I think that that's exactly what we need to do. And I can think of I don't know if you know more about Kerala, the experiences there. But I think it's something very local and that has brought a very concrete notion of what public services may look like. I have another one from this country, but it's, as usual on these things, very complicated because there are political issues, and of course they are there. And it's the case of the mayor of Recoleta. You know that Santiago is two things. Santiago is a city and it's also a municipality. Next to the municipality of Santiago, there's another one called Recoleta, and there you have a communist mayor who has not done very well lately in trying to unite the left, but who did really well in being a great mayor at the level of creating public services. And these public services were concrete things. It was like, people didn't have money for medicines. Well, he put a popular pharmacy for people to have access to medicines. People didn't have books. Well, he made a public library where people could have books. People didn't have glasses, so he made, an opticians so that they could actually access these things. So I think that on the sexiness, I think we need to just make sure that we work on providing clear images that people can imagine a better future. The motto that he was working with was, "It is possible to live better," or something like that. I'm probably paraphrasing it in a wrong way, but this idea that it is impossible to live better, that it's completely forgotten in the more popular municipalities which have a lot of poverty. I also wanted to react on what you said about Corbyn, and I don't want to make it an issue of names, because I think that that's the best way to get us not being united, and we need to work for being united. But I just wanted to add that the experiences that they have been protecting, not just Corbyn, but a bunch of people through the Progressive International, they've been the ones that have been here when things have happened. When it came to Ecuador and the election was lost, they were here looking at the election and expressing solidarity. When the same thing and the stakes were high in Colombia, they were here reporting it. When in Chile we lost the referendum, they were here trying to not have that result. When Lula won, they were here again, and when Cristina in Argentina almost got shot, they were here expressing solidarity. I haven't seen other leaders doing this thing. So we don't have a lot. So yes, with their mistakes, with their things that I also don't like, I think we need to also recognize those things. And on the last thing, I wanted to very briefly relate that I'm not so sure that the Swedish example, Sylvain, is the best one, because quite frankly, I really would like us to get to a half of what the Swedish have. And I see it more as an exception rather than the general rule. You know, let's first build those welfare states, and let's later worry about what could happen that in a situation when we actually have those things, they could get away from us. But I think that the other way around, it's lots of people are fighting for getting a quarter of what they have.
So if there are other inputs, let's have one or two more inputs. I think we need to try to wrap up. We've got some really interesting thoughts and notes and observations which we need to then process. I am interested to hear one or two thoughts about what might be next steps as well. And I've got a couple of things I want to say at the end, but let's just hear what else there is over here.
It's more of a question to respond to Angela's comment earlier, because I'm just testing, because I think your point was powerful about what will and won't sway, for example, the Ugandan government or the politicians there, like this reframing, that making this more political, perhaps with like influential politicians in the African context. Is that something that could have value in your national context, or is it more like an African regional commission, a high-level commission for different regions? Obviously, you couldn't do them all at once, but like, what would be more? Is this moving in the right direction for the point that you made earlier? Is my question.
I don't think I have the answer. Why? It's because we have tested this. When we started doing the work around regulation of school fees in both private and public schools, but looking at the private schools, we looked at who would be ideal like champions for that work. So we identified people from parliament and what. But when we started doing the background checks, we found out that actually these people are owning schools. Like, usually what happens in my country is that it's very difficult to do a search and see that it is this person who owns this school. You find like, you have to really dig and see. So having something that is really political, have the political big weights, can work, but to the extent that you have really done, that due diligence to find out who these people are. I think that due diligence is needed to find out the legitimacy of these people. Who are they? And what do they really stand for, apart from being in the public and saying this, and you call them, because politicians will always be politicians. They will say, what do these people want to hear? And they can, align to that. But I think, yes, being too political, of course, works in terms of getting political mileage, but going that extra mile to research and understand who these people are. Otherwise, you might get someone in the room, on the team, who is just there to, as a spy, to undo what you're doing, and is working actually with the private sector and using that to work with the private sector, to earn from the private sector.
So lastly, in terms of, I think it's time to get a bit to the next steps. I think we've, by and large, had a reasonably positive response, but everyone seems to have visualized a different elephant in the room. We've had everything from let's do our own independent commission, to let's not have a global one, let's have it regionally, to let's have politicians, to whatever else we do, let's not have politicians. So therefore, it might be useful to summarize what the various options are and what the political implications of whichever models have come up. So that we've had a wide wheeling conversation, but we haven't really reached to a point of we really understand what the options are. So therefore, we have started with a few questions of how do you delimit public services. We have asked ourselves which spaces can one latch on to, what could be the format of the commission. Some of those options, if someone can work upon it, look at the pros and cons, and maybe, because I guess also it's partly that everyone is exhausted by now.
Oh, no, my point was mainly to Angela's. And I was just wondering about the question about the fact that there might be people who have a lot of political weight and can sway politically, but who are compromised in one way or another. And the question is, in our selection, like we might have to decide how much compromise we are willing to, make, especially in the African context.
Okay, so I think we probably should wrap up because I think we've all had a very long day. I think there's a level of exhaustion. I think laying out a sort of suggestions for way forward. One or two very quick final comments.
Yeah, this meeting brought a big number of people to Chile. Our Future is Public, and I know there were other meetings that were happening at the same time. And in the spirit of making this participatory, I'm suggesting that can we do some kind of survey where we send out questions to all the participants, because we have access to the database of all the people who are in Chile for this meeting. By the time they're in Chile for this meeting, they believe in this cause. So send out that survey to all the participants and, structure those questions where we are able to get direct responses, and then a team can go through that. And basically, and we also have different like convenings, education and all that can follow up with the different people that they have brought to Chile to make sure that we get as many responses as possible in the spirit of making it participatory.
Yeah, very practically, I completely agree with Angela that we need to discuss the various options, but we also need a group of people who are going to do this work and who will volunteer to do this work. And I don't know if this group exists already, but I think starting to collect the emails of all the people here who wants to participate and other people who might be willing to participate would be a good start.
So I think that sort of all comes together quite neatly with the idea of putting out a survey, because one of the questions in a survey could be, are you interested in helping us to process this and develop it further? I think, for me, it does come together. So the idea of laying out the different options around spaces or framing and the profile of people. I think we've got a document at the moment which I think we need to sort of strip back down to. These are a series of options about framing. These are a series of ways of focusing in terms of the target spaces. This is the sort of different options for the profiles of people, and then ask people to make active suggestions within that framework, their preferences on different things, and active suggestions for particular candidates who they think would be really powerful and resonant in their region or for their theme or for their particular public service. And I think that's something which we can do immediately after this conference. I don't think it's going to, and we can ask for the volunteers in that service. If you want to help us take this forward further, then please get in touch. I mean, I'm definitely committed to continuing to engage in helping to pull it together. We'll see who else is going to be willing. I'm not going to volunteer anybody else, but definitely there's the steering committee or the core organizing committee of the conference that prepared this overall conference, I think, is interested in taking this idea forward, and I think it will be one of the ideas that we should probably put into the Santiago Declaration, that we will be working towards consulting with everyone in order to refine and define a way of making a successful independent commission on public services that could complement the work of the movement. It's not a substitute for, but a complement to the work that we're going to do together. And we can keep that as a fairly high-level statement in the declaration. And we work on a survey that I think probably needs to go out pretty soon, whether we send it out before the end of the year or early in the new year, to help shape this a little bit further. But I found this really useful. I mean, it's the first time I've actually been able to engage in a face-to-face conversation about this, and we've been sort of thinking through this for quite a long time, sort of with comments in documents or like a few minutes snatched here and there on a Zoom call. It's really important that we do get together and start building something together, and a face-to-face conversation is just no substitute for laying out the issues more clearly. So thank you very much for being here, and I think we all deserve a bit of a break now after a very long day. I know that there are events later this evening. I think there's a launch of the History Repeated, or the second, whatever it's, I can't actually remember what it's called, which Eurodad are doing at 7 o'clock. There may be other things going on as well, but we probably deserve a break before we go to any of that. So thank you very much, and brilliant.